I'm Elena, I'm 26 years old, and last night, my mother called me a stain on the family name in front of 300 people right before I made sure she'd never be able to use that name again. The ballroom of the Grand Pierre Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal. The air smelled of expensive lily and the sharp metallic tang of aged champagne. I stood near the velvet curtains, my hands steady, feeling the weight of the silk slip dress against my skin. It was a deep bruised purple, the color of a secret kept too long. Across the room, my mother, Evelyn Vance, stood under the glow of a $1 million chandelier. Her diamond necklace caught the light, casting jagged reflections against the mahogany pillars like tiny, sharp knives. She looked perfect. She always did. As the founder of the Vance Children's Foundation, her reputation was built on a foundation of grace and untouchable charity. But I knew what was rotting beneath the floorboards. I had approached her quietly, hoping for one last shred of maternal instinct. I just wanted her to tell the truth about the missing funds before the auditors arrived. I leaned in, whispering so only she could hear. Mom, we need to talk about the offshore account. It's not too late to fix this. Evelyn didn't even flinch. She took a slow sip of her drink, turned her head just enough so her perfume, something floral and suffocating, filled my senses, and spoke with a voice like dry ice. You are a talentless, ungrateful disgrace, Elena, she said, her smile never wavering for the benefit of the cameras nearby. You've always been the cracked glass in this house. If you utter another word about my business, I will ensure you are erased from this social circle so thoroughly that even the ghosts won't remember your name. Now move. You're blocking the light. The sting should have been sharp, but it was dull. I had heard variations of this my entire life. I was the disgrace because I asked questions. I was the crack because I didn't want to lie. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. Instead, I reached into my small beaded clutch and felt the cold, hard edges of a silver USB drive. I looked her directly in the eyes, those cold blue eyes that had never once looked at me with love, and I gave her a small, tight smile. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was the smile of an executioner. I turned on my heel and walked toward the sound booth at the back of the hall, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the polished marble. Before I tell you what was on that drive and how I watched her empire crumble while I sipped a glass of water, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now, let's go back to where it all began. The rust started 3 months ago. It was a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it felt beige. I was working as the junior administrator for the foundation, a job my mother gave me not out of kindness, but to keep me under her thumb. My office was in the basement of our Greenwich estate, a room that smelled of old paper and damp stone, far away from the sun-drenched solarium where Evelyn took her tea. I was reconciling the year-end donations when I saw it. A transfer of $2.2 million. It wasn't the amount that startled me. The foundation handled tens of millions. It was the destination. Lucent Holdings. I had never heard of Lucent. I checked the vendor list. Nothing. I checked the project logs. Nothing. My heart began to thud, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the incorporation papers for Lucent Holdings from the state registry late that night, the blue light of my laptop screen the only thing illuminating my face in the dark basement. The registered agent wasn't a lawyer or a businessman. It was a shell company owned by another shell company, but the signature at the bottom of the original filing was unmistakable. It was a sharp, aggressive E, followed by a jagged V. My mother wasn't just running a charity. She was running a vacuum. For weeks, I moved through the house like a ghost. I watched her at breakfast, delicately peeling a grapefruit, while I knew she was stealing from children who didn't have shoes. I watched her at dinner, complaining about the laziness of the working class, while $2 million of donated money sat in a Cayman account with her name on it. Every time I tried to bring up the accounting errors, she would shut me down with a look of pure disgust. Stick to the filing, Elena. Leave the thinking to people with actual vision. She thought I was too weak to fight back. She thought my silence was a sign of submission. She didn't realize that I wasn't staying silent because I was afraid. I was staying silent because I was collecting. Every invoice, every forged signature, every disgraceful comment she threw at me was another file added to the drive. The night of the gala wasn't supposed to be the end. I had given her one last chance to come clean. But as I stood by the sound booth, watching her laugh with the senator, I realized that some people don't want a way out. They just want a bigger throne. I handed the USB drive to the young technician at the soundboard. He looked at me confused. Is this for the tribute video? He asked. Something like that, I whispered. Wait for the keynote speech. When she says the word legacy, hit play. I walked back into the crowd, feeling lighter than I had in years. I found a spot near the exit, my eyes fixed on my mother as she took the stage, the applause thundering through the hall. She looked like a queen. But I knew that in exactly 5 minutes, the crown was going to be very, very heavy. As she adjusted the microphone, she caught my eye and narrowed hers, a silent warning to stay in my place. I simply raised my chin. But as the first slide of her presentation appeared on the screen, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a second person standing in the wings of the stage, watching me with a look of sheer terror. It was my sister, Clara, and she was holding a folder that looked identical to mine. The ballroom was a tomb of expectation, but my mind was miles away, drifting back to the hallways of our childhood home. To understand why my sister Clara was standing in the wings with a look of pure terror, you have to understand the architecture of the Vance family. In our house, love was a currency, and the exchange rate was set by Evelyn. Clara was the golden child. She was the one who played the violin until her fingers bled, the one who wore the white lace dresses and never got a speck of dirt on them. She was the vessel for my mother's unfulfilled dreams of being a concert soloist. I, on the other hand, was the scrapbook daughter, the one who filled the gaps in the background, the one who was meant to be seen just enough to prove we were a complete family, but never heard. I remember a summer afternoon when we were teenagers. The air was thick with the scent of mown grass and the expensive chlorine of the infinity pool. Clara had just won a regional competition. My mother had thrown a garden party that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Look at her," Evelyn had whispered to a circle of socialites, her hand resting heavily on Clara's shoulder. "She is the future of the Vance legacy. Precision, beauty, and absolute control." I was standing 5 feet away, holding a tray of lemonades because the catering staff was short-handed and my mother thought it would build character. I saw the way. Clara's hand trembled as she held her bow. I saw the way her eyes darted to the gate, longing for an exit. I saw the girl behind the gold. "And Elena?" one of the guests asked, glancing at me. My mother didn't even turn around. "Elena is reliable. Every garden needs a fence, darling. You don't look at the fence, but you're glad it's there to keep the weeds out." That was the day I realized I wasn't a person to her. I was an appliance. A fence. Something meant to be functional and invisible. As we grew older, the divide deepened. Clara was sent to Juilliard. I was sent to a local business college to learn the practicalities of managing the foundation's back end. My mother wanted me to be the silent engine that kept her vanity project running, while Clara was the shiny hood ornament. But silence has a way of becoming a vantage point. Because I was invisible, I saw everything. I saw the way my mother would disappear into her study with consultants who looked more like debt collectors. I saw the way she would snap at the maids until they cried, then walk onto a stage 10 minutes later and speak about compassion for the vulnerable. A month before the gala, I caught Clara in a solarium. The room was beautiful, all glass and tropical ferns, but it felt like a cage. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by bank statements. Her violin sat in its case, untouched for weeks. "Elena," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I think Mom is sick." "She's not sick, Clara," I said, sitting down beside her. "She's greedy. There's a difference." Clara showed me a document she had found in the piano bench. It was a personal loan agreement, signed by our mother, using Clara's future inheritance as collateral. $500,000 had been moved to cover a shortfall in the foundation's luxury travel budget. "She's using me," Clara said, her eyes wide with the realization I had reached a decade ago. "She's using all of us." I looked at my sister, the girl who was supposed to be the perfect one, and saw the cracks forming in her porcelain skin. My mother hadn't just neglected me. She had been consuming Clara, piece by piece, to fuel her own image. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Clara didn't answer then. She just closed the folder and tucked it away. I assumed she would do what she always did, practice her scales and wait for the storm to pass. I didn't think she had the spine to fight. But standing there in the gala, seeing her in the wings, I realized I had been wrong. Clara wasn't just a victim. She was a witness. The keynote speech was beginning. My mother stepped up to the podium, the spotlight centering on her like a halo. She looked out at the crowd, her face a mask of practiced humility. "Legacy," she began, her voice echoing through the mahogany hall, "is not about what we take from this world. It is about what we leave behind for those who cannot speak for themselves." The technician's hand moved toward the play button. My heart felt like a bird trapped in a box, thrumming with a frantic, rhythmic beat. I looked at Clara. She looked back at me, her face pale, her knuckles white as she gripped her own folder. I thought I was the only one with a secret. I thought I was the only one who had been digging through the dirt. But as the screen behind my mother flickered, transitioning from a photo of a smiling child to a spreadsheet of offshore accounts, I realized Clara wasn't there to support me. She was there to do something much, much worse. The silence in the ballroom was different now. It wasn't the respectful hush that usually accompanied my mother's speeches. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of people trying to process a mistake. On the massive screen behind Evelyn, the vibrant photos of orphans and renovated schools had vanished. In their place was a stark black and white spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, source, Foundation General Fund. Column C, recipient, Lucent Holdings. The numbers were staggering. $50,000 here, $200,000 there. A steady rhythmic draining of the well. My mother didn't see it at first. She was still mid-sentence, her hand raised in a graceful gesture of philanthropy. And so, when we look at the legacy we leave, she paused, sensing the shift in the room. The socialites in the front row, women who had known her for decades, were no longer looking at her. They were looking up, their mouths slightly agape, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Evelyn turned her head slowly, her silk dress rustling like a snake in dry grass. She saw the numbers. She saw her own digital signature, glowing in high definition for the world to see. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Her face didn't crumple. It hardened. It became a marble bust of fury. She looked toward the sound booth, then her gaze whipped across the room, searching. When she found me, standing by the exit, her eyes didn't show fear. They showed a promise of total destruction. But then she looked at the wings. She saw Clara, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother's hand shake. To understand why those numbers were there, we have to go back to the rainy Tuesday 3 weeks before the gala. The rain wasn't a storm. It was a persistent gray drizzle that turned the Greenwich estate into a watercolor painting of sadness. I had been sitting in the Foundation's archives, a climate-controlled room in the city office that smelled of ozone and expensive dust. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had told the security guard I was looking for historical donor records for the gala program. He had smiled and let me in. He liked me. I was the nice Vance. I spent hours pulling physical files, comparing them to the digital logs I had accessed in the basement. That's when I found the discrepancy that changed everything. The digital logs showed the $2.2 million going to Lucent Holdings for educational infrastructure. But the physical receipts, the ones my mother thought were too old for anyone to check, told a different story. I found a handwritten note tucked inside a 22 ledger. It was on heavy cream-colored stationery with the letterhead of a high-end jewelry boutique in Paris. Dear Mrs. Vance, the 12-carat sapphire has been secured. The remaining balance of $1.8 million has been settled via Lucent. Enjoy the brilliance. I felt a coldness spread from my fingertips to my chest. She wasn't just stealing to maintain the estate or cover losses. She was stealing to drape herself in blue stones while the infrastructure she promised the public remained nothing but blueprints and empty lots. I sat on the floor of the archives, surrounded by boxes, and I cried. Not because I was surprised, but because I realized that the woman who had raised me was a hollow shell. Everything, the gala, the speeches, the disgrace comments, it was all a projection to hide a thief. I spent the rest of that night scanning every document into my phone. Every time the scanner flashed, it felt like a camera capturing a crime scene. I realized then that I couldn't just tell the board of directors. They were her friends. I couldn't go to the police yet. She had lawyers who could bury me before I reached the precinct. I needed a stage. I needed a moment where she couldn't hide behind a mahogany desk or a legal team. As I walked out of the archives that night, the rain had turned into a downpour. I stood under the awning, clutching my bag to my chest. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. Elena, I found something else. Meet me at the boathouse tomorrow. Don't tell Mom. The boathouse was a quiet, damp place at the edge of our property. When I met her there the next morning, the mist was rolling off the water, gray and thick. Clara looked like she hadn't slept. She was wearing a trench coat, her hair damp and tangled. I looked into the Lucent accounts, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping water. It's not just the jewelry, Elena. She's been using the foundation to pay off her gambling debts in Macau. The $2 million secret? That's just the tip of it. She handed me a folder. Inside were wire transfer confirmations. My mother hadn't just been greedy. She had been desperate. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. You're her favorite. You have everything to lose. Clara looked out at the water, her expression unreadable. I'm not her favorite, Elena. I'm her collateral. And I'm tired of being owned. Standing in the ballroom now, watching the legacy slide bleed into the Lucent Holdings spreadsheet, I realized Clara had done more than just find documents. She had coordinated with the technician too. But as the room erupted into a low murmur of scandal, I saw my mother regain her composure. She stepped back to the microphone, her face a mask of calm. "There seems to be a technical error," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "A malicious attempt to defame this foundation by a disgruntled employee. However," she looked directly at the wings, toward Clara. "My daughter Clara has the actual records here to prove our integrity. Clara, dear, come out and show them the truth." The room went silent again. All eyes turned to the wings. I held my breath. Was Clara going to fold? Was the golden child going to protect the hand that fed her, or was she going to bite it? Clara stepped out onto the stage, the folder trembling in her hand. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at me. And in that look, I saw a secret that wasn't in any folder. The air in the ballroom was so thin it felt like it might snap. Clara stood center stage, the harsh white spotlight reflecting off the silver sequins of her gown, making her look like a ghost caught in a hunter's trap. My mother, Evelyn, stood 2 feet away, her hand extended a gesture that looked like an invitation but felt like a leash. "Clara, dear," Evelyn prompted, her voice a low melodic purr that carried through the speakers. "Show them the real records. Clear up this unfortunate glitch." For a moment, I thought my sister would break. She looked small. She looked like the girl who used to hide in the coat closet when our parents fought. But then Clara did something I didn't expect. She didn't open the folder. She didn't hand it to our mother. She simply walked to the edge of the stage, looked directly at the front row of journalists, and whispered, "The glitch isn't on the screen. The glitch is in this family." She didn't wait for a reaction. She turned and walked off the stage, disappearing into the velvet shadows of the wings. The room exploded. 100 voices rose at once, a tidal wave of scandal that crashed against the mahogany walls. My mother stood frozen, her hand still extended to a daughter who was no longer there. Her face, usually so porcelain and perfect, began to twitch. The mask was finally cracking. To understand why Clara walked away, we have to go back to the Sunday before the gala. The gaslight dinner. It was a quiet evening at the Greenwich estate. The dining room was a cavern of shadows, lit only by a silver candelabra that cast flickering, orange light across the heavy damask tablecloth. The smell of roasted lamb and rosemary hung in the air, thick and cloying. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her movements precise as she sliced her meat. I sat to her right. Clara to her left. We were a portrait of a happy family, if you didn't look at the way our knuckles were white from gripping our forks. "I know what you've been doing, Elena," my mother said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. She didn't look up from her plate. "The archives, the basement logs. You've been playing detective." I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline. "I was doing my job, Mom. The numbers didn't add up." "Numbers are like children," she replied, finally looking at me. Her eyes were flat, devoid of the warmth she showed the cameras. "They only say what they're told to say. You've been listening to the wrong voices." She reached into her silk robe and pulled out 2 envelopes. She slid one toward me and one toward Clara. They were thick, expensive paper, sealed with red wax. "These are non-disclosure agreements," she said. "And inside are checks. $1 million for each of you. Think of it as an early inheritance. A gift for your loyalty. And your silence." The silence in the room was deafening. I looked at the envelope. It was the price of my soul, wrapped in a $2 million secret. "Is this from the loosened account?" I asked, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "It doesn't matter where it's from. What matters is where you go from here. You can be a Vance, with all the prestige and comfort that entails. Or you can be a disgrace, living in a studio apartment, wondering why no one will hire a girl who betrayed her own mother." She turned her gaze to Clara. "And you, my darling. Your violin career is just starting. Imagine the headlines if your mother is caught in a misunderstanding. The sponsors will vanish. The stages will go dark. Is your integrity worth more than your music?" I watched Clara. She was looking at the envelope like it was a poisonous snake. Her lip trembled. She was the golden child, the one who lived for the applause. My mother knew exactly where to twist the knife. "Sign them," Evelyn commanded. "For the sake of the family. For the sake of the children we help." I looked at the roast lamb, the silver, the crystal, all bought with stolen dreams. I realized then that my mother didn't see us as daughters. We were just more assets to be managed, more holes to be plugged in her leaking ship. "I need time to think," I said, pushing the envelope back. "I don't," Clara whispered. She picked up the envelope and stood up. She didn't sign it. She didn't open it. She just walked out of the dining room, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Evelyn watched her go, a small triumphant smile playing on her lips. She thought Clara had taken the money. She thought she had won. She turned back to me, her smile sharpening. Don't be the difficult one, Elena. It's such an ugly look on you. That night, I sat in my room, watching the moon reflect off the dark water of the Sound. I realized that my mother's power didn't come from her money or her name. It came from our fear of losing them. But when you've been treated like a fence your whole life, you realize you don't need the garden. You just need the gate. Back in the ballroom, the chaos was reaching a fever pitch. Security was trying to usher the press out, but it was too late. The live stream was already viral. The disgrace had finally spoken, and the stain was spreading. I saw my mother move toward the back exit, her head held high, though her steps were hurried. She walked right past me, her perfume hitting me like a slap. This isn't over, Elena, she hissed, her voice barely a whisper. I have friends you haven't even met yet. She disappeared through the service door. I stood there for a moment, the adrenaline fading into a strange, hollow coldness. I looked toward the wings where Clara had vanished. I needed to find her. I needed to know what she meant by the glitch in the family. But as I moved toward the stage, a hand caught my arm. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't Clara. It was a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a badge. Miss Vance? He asked. I'm with the Forensic Audit Division. We've been watching the live stream. We'd like to have a word about Lucent Holdings. My heart skipped a beat. The plan was working. But as I looked at the man's grim expression, I realized that the $2 million secret was only the beginning. There was someone else behind Lucent, someone my mother was even more afraid of than the truth. The investigator's grip on my arm was firm but not aggressive. It felt like an anchor in the middle of a storm. Around us, the gala was dissolving into a frantic blur of tuxedoed men and women fleeing the scene as if the building were on fire. The forensic audit badge glinted under the dimming ballroom lights, a small silver shield against the chaos. I have the files, I whispered, my voice surprisingly steady. I have everything you need. We know, Miss Vance, the man said, his eyes scanning the room, but we're not the only ones looking for them. We need to move, now. He led me through a side exit, away from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi who were now swarming the front entrance. We stepped out into the cool, damp night air. The city smelled of rain-slicked asphalt and exhaust. A black sedan was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a predator. As we drove away from the Grand Pier, the lights of the city blurred into long golden streaks against the window. I felt a strange sense of mourning. The life I had known, the gilded cage, the silent dinners, the weight of the Vance name was disappearing in the rearview mirror. Where are we going? I asked. To see the one person who knows how this web was actually spun, the investigator replied. Someone your mother thought she had disposed of years ago. We arrived at a small, cramped apartment in a part of the city where the streetlights flickered and the paint on the brick buildings was peeling like sunburned skin. The air inside the hallway was heavy with the scent of boiled cabbage and old tobacco. We stopped at a door with a tarnished brass number, 4B. The man who opened the door was thin, with skin the color of parchment and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. This was Arthur Pendergast. 10 years ago, he had been the chief financial officer for the Vance Foundation. Then, he had suddenly retired due to health reasons. The society pages said he had gone to a private villa in Italy. The reality was much grimmer. Elena, he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. You look just like her, but you have your father's eyes. They were always too honest for their own good. The apartment was filled with towers of paper boxes upon boxes of ledgers, bank statements, and legal briefs. This wasn't a home. It was a library of revenge. I've been waiting for this day, Arthur said, gesturing for me to sit on a rickety wooden chair. He poured a glass of lukewarm water and pushed it toward me. Your mother thinks she's a mastermind, but she's just a middleman. Lucent Holdings isn't her invention. It belongs to a man named Marcus Thorne. The name hit me like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne was a shadow in the high-stakes world of international finance. He was the man people called when they wanted money to disappear or when they wanted people to disappear. My mother is working for Thorne? I asked, my heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm. She's not working for him, Elena. She's in debt to him, Arthur explained, leaning over a table covered in flowcharts. The $2 million you found? That wasn't just for jewelry or gambling. That was interest. Your mother took a massive loan from Thorne to keep the foundation afloat after a series of bad investments years ago. She's been cannibalizing the charity to pay back a shark who never gets full. I looked at the charts. It was a map of a slow-motion car crash. My mother hadn't just been greedy. She had been trapped. She called me a disgrace to hide the fact that she was a slave to her own vanity. She used Clara's inheritance to pay him, didn't she? I asked, remembering the folder Clara had shown me. And yours, Arthur says softly. She signed over everything. If the foundation falls, you and your sister are left with nothing but a debt. Thorne doesn't care about names. He cares about collateral. I sat back, the weight of the $2 million secret suddenly feeling much heavier. This wasn't just about exposing a fraud. This was about a war between a mother who had sold her children's future and a daughter who was about to burn down the bank. There's one more thing, Arthur said, reaching into a locked drawer. He pulled out a grainy, black and white photograph. It showed my mother standing on a pier, handing a briefcase to a man whose face was obscured by a hat. This was taken the night your father died. The police called it an accident, a fall from the deck of his boat. But I know what was in that briefcase. It was the first payment to Thorne. The room seemed to tilt. My father's death had been the wound that never healed for me. To think that his accident was just a transaction. It turned the coldness in my chest into a searing fire. I need to find Clara, I said, standing up. She's in danger, isn't she? She knows too much, and she's too public now, Arthur warned. Thorne likes shadows. Clara just stepped into a spotlight. I looked at my phone. I had 12 missed calls from an unknown number. Just as I went to dial back, a text appeared. It wasn't from Clara. It was from my mother. Come to the boathouse alone, Elena. If you want your sister to see the sunrise, bring the drive. The message was calm. It was precise. It was the voice of a woman who had finally run out of lies and was left with nothing but iron. I looked at Arthur, then at the investigator. I knew I should tell them. I knew I should wait for backup. But I could still smell the lily from the gala, and I could still hear my mother calling me a disgrace. I took a deep breath, tucked the USB drive into my pocket, and walked out into the night. I wasn't the fence anymore. I was the storm. But as I reached the street, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The black sedan that had brought me here was gone. In its place stood a silver luxury car I recognized all too well. The window rolled down, and the smell of floral, suffocating perfume filled the air. The silver car sat like a shark in the shallow water of the street. The engine hummed a low, expensive purr that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. As the rear window slid down with a mechanical hiss, the scent of jasmine and lily of the valley drifted out, thick enough to choke the damp city air. My mother didn't look like a woman who had just been publicly humiliated. She sat in the shadows of the leather interior, her spine perfectly straight, her hands folded over a silk clutch. Her makeup was flawless, though the streetlights cast long skeletal shadows across her cheekbones. Get in, Elena, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was weary, the way a teacher might speak to a particularly stubborn child. Don't make a scene in this charming neighborhood. We have matters to discuss that don't involve the help. I didn't move. I kept my hand on the USB drive in my pocket, the cold metal a reminder of the power I held. Where is Clara? Evelyn sighed, a soft, patronizing sound. Clara is where she has always been, at the center of a mess she doesn't understand. She's at the estate, under the care of people far more professional than those auditors you've been consorting with. Now get in. Or I'll let Mr. Thorne's associates handle the collection of that drive. They aren't as fond of conversation as I am. The mention of Marcus Thorne sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I realized then that my mother wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was a cornered animal trying to negotiate for her life. I stepped into the car. The door closed with a heavy pressurized thud, sealing us in a tomb of quiet luxury. The drive back to Greenwich was silent. I watched the city lights fade into the dark, wooded silhouettes of the suburbs. My mother didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the back of the driver's head. He was a man I'd never seen before, broad-shouldered, with a neck like a pillar of stone. When we reached the estate, the house looked different. The grand white pillars, usually bathed in welcoming spotlights, were dark. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the black glass of the windows. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. We didn't go to the main house. The driver steered the car down the winding gravel path toward the boathouse. The sound of the tires crushing the stones was rhythmic, like bone being ground to powder. Inside the boathouse, the air was cold and tasted of salt and rot. A single lantern sat on a wooden table, casting flickering shadows against the rafters. Clara was there. She was sitting on a bench, her violin case at her feet. She wasn't tied up, but she looked paralyzed, her eyes wide and glassy. Standing behind her was a man in a tailored gray suit. He was peeling an orange with a small, silver pocket knife. Elena, Clara whispered. I'm sorry. I tried to leave, but... It's all right, Clara, I said. My voice echoing in the hollow space, I turned to my mother. You have the daughters you always wanted now, trapped and silent. Is this the legacy you talked about at the gala? Evelyn walked to the center of the room, her silk heels clicking sharply on the damp wood. She turned to the man in the gray suit. Mr. Rossi, my daughter has brought the device. We can end this tonight. Rossi didn't look up from his orange. Your daughter brought a device, Evelyn. Whether it's the right one remains to be seen. Mr. Thorne is very tired of technical errors. My mother flinched. The mask finally fell away, revealing a hollow, desperate terror. She turned to me, her voice trembling for the first time. Give it to him, Elena, please. You think you're being a hero? You're just lighting a fire in a room we're all locked in. If Thorne doesn't get those logs back, if they go to the authorities, none of us leave this property. I looked at the USB drive. I thought of Arthur Pendergast's cramped apartment. I thought of my father falling from a boat into the dark water. And then I looked at my mother, the woman who had called me a disgrace while she sold our lives to a monster. You're right, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dead whisper. It is an ugly look on me. But I think it suits you much better. I didn't hand the drive to Rossi. I walked over to the edge of the boathouse, where the floorboards ended and the dark turning water of the Sound began. I held the drive over the edge. One move, I said to Rossi, and $2 million worth of evidence goes into the silt. You'll never find it, and your boss will know you let a disgrace beat you. Rossi stopped peeling his orange. He closed the knife with a click that sounded like a gunshot. Elena, don't. Evelyn shrieked, reaching out a hand. He'll kill us. He's going to kill your reputation anyway, Evelyn, I said, looking her in the eye. I'm just deciding who gets to watch the fire. I looked at Clara. She was no longer looking at the floor. She was looking at me, and for the first time, I saw a spark of the fire I felt in her own eyes. She slowly reached into her violin case, but she didn't pull out her instrument. She pulled out something small, black and metallic. My heart stopped. My sister, the golden child, the concert soloist, wasn't just a witness anymore. She was holding a recording device that was already glowing red, and she was pointing it directly at Rossi and our mother. You forgot one thing, Mom, Clara said, her voice steady and cold. The gala livestream wasn't the leak. It was just the bait. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of a siren in the distance, wailing like a ghost coming home. But as the sound grew closer, I realized the sirens weren't coming from the road. They were coming from the water. The sound of the waterborne sirens grew into a deafening roar, reflecting off the stone walls of the boathouse. Blue and red lights sliced through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, illuminating the terror on my mother's face. She looked like a trapped bird, her eyes darting between me, the dark water, and the shadow of the man in the gray suit. Mr. Rossi didn't panic. That was the most terrifying part. He simply stood there, the half-peeled orange still in his hand, watching the police boats approach with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a lab rat. You think you've won, Elena, he said, his voice barely audible over the sirens. But all you've done is invite the police to a crime scene where you and your sister are the primary suspects. Who do you think the authorities will believe? A pillar of the community like Evelyn Vance, or two daughters with a history of emotional instability and a stolen USB drive? They won't have to choose who to believe, Clara said. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the damp wood. She held the small recording device aloft like a trophy. Because they've been listening for the last 20 minutes. Every word about Marcus Thorne. Every admission of the $2 million debt. Every threat. It's all been broadcasted directly to the precinct. My mother sank onto a crate, her silk dress staining with the dampness of the floor. Clara, how could you? I gave you everything. You gave me a cage and told me it was a stage, Mom, Clara replied. Her voice didn't waver. It was the calmest I had ever heard her. You didn't protect us. You used us as shields against a man you were too weak to face. The boathouse doors were kicked open with a thunderous crash. Officers swarmed the room, their flashlights cutting through the mist. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was the investigator from the gala, his face grim but satisfied. Step away from the water, Miss Vance, he commanded. I didn't move yet. I looked at my mother. She was being lifted to her feet by two officers. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just looked at me with a cold, hollow hatred that felt like a physical weight. You've destroyed us, she whispered as they led her toward the door. You've burned the house down just to see the light. The house was already on fire, Mom, I said. I just opened the windows. As they escorted Rossi and my mother out, the investigator stayed behind. He looked at the USB drive still in my hand. We need that, Elena. It's the final piece. The offshore accounts, the wire transfers, it all leads back to Thorne. We've been trying to pin him for years, but no one ever had the spine to turn over the ledgers. I looked at the silver drive. It felt heavy not with data, but with the weight of my family's history. I'll give it to you. But I want to be the one to press send on the public release. The world needs to see what the Vance legacy actually looks like. The investigator nodded slowly. We can arrange that. But you should know. Thorne isn't the type to let a debt go unpaid. Even from a jail cell, a man like that has a long reach. He walked away, leaving Clara and me alone in the quiet of the boathouse. The sirens were fading into the distance, leaving only the sound of the water lapping against the pilings. Clara sat down on the bench, her violin case in her lap. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline in her body in visible shudders. I sat beside her, and for the first time in years, I took her hand. It was cold but steady. What now? She asked. Now, I said, we stop being the golden child and the disgrace. We just become Elena and Clara. The money is gone, isn't it? She asked softly. The inheritance, the estate, everything. Yes, I said. It's all gone. We're starting at zero. Clara looked around the dark, rotting boathouse. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Zero feels surprisingly light. We sat there for a long time, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray water into a bruise of purple and gold. I thought about the $2 million secret and the woman who had traded her soul for it. I thought about the disgrace she had tried to brand me with. But as I looked at the morning light, I realized there was one final thing my mother hadn't told us. A secret that wasn't in the ledgers or on the USB drive. A secret that would change everything we thought we knew about our father's death. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper I had snatched from my mother's desk during the gaslight dinner. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a letter, dated 2 days ago, from a law firm I didn't recognize. I opened it, and as I read the first line, the breath left my lungs. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting long golden fingers across the water. The boathouse, once a place of shadows and threats, was now just a collection of old wood and salt air. Clara was watching me, her head tilted, noticing the way the paper trembled in my hand. Elena? She asked, her voice a soft ripple in the morning quiet. What is it? I couldn't speak. My eyes were locked on the elegant, embossed script of the letterhead, sterling and cross, attorneys at law. The letter wasn't addressed to my mother, Evelyn. It was addressed to the estate of Julian Vance, my father. Dear Mrs. Vance, the letter began. As per the standing instructions left by your late husband in the event of a public audit of the foundation, we are notifying you that a safe harbor trust has been activated. The documents you sought to suppress are now being released to the designated secondary beneficiary. I turned the page. Attached was a copy of a life insurance policy, but not the kind I had seen before. This one wasn't for money. It was for information. My father hadn't died in an accident. He had known the ship was sinking. He had known Evelyn was trading their souls to Marcus Thorne, and he had built a cage of his own to catch her if she ever fell. He wasn't the victim I thought he was. He was the architect of the very trap I had just sprung. And I was the secondary beneficiary. He knew, I whispered, the words tasting like copper. He didn't leave us with nothing, Clara. He left us the matches. I handed the letter to Clara. As she read, her face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, grief, and finally, a strange, hollow relief. Our mother had spent 10 years calling us failures, using us as pawns to pay off a monster, while all along, our father had been waiting in the shadows of a legal file to set us free. The $2 million secret wasn't the end of the story. It was the key to a much larger vault. 3 days later, I stood in the center of my new life. It was a small apartment in the city, far from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. The air smelled of cheap floor wax, and the coffee brewing in the kitchen, not lily and jasmine. It was perfect. On the desk sat my laptop. The forensic auditors had finished their initial sweep. The news was filled with images of Evelyn Vance being led into a courthouse, her head finally bowed, her signature silk scarf replaced by the drab gray of a legal blanket. Marcus Thorne's name was being whispered in every major news outlet, a shadow finally dragged into the light. I opened a file on my screen. It was a public statement, a final leak that would distribute the remaining assets of the foundation to the actual charities they were meant for, bypassing the debt, bypassing the lawyers, and bypassing the Vance name entirely. I felt a presence at the door. Clara stood there, her violin case over her shoulder. She looked different. The golden child shine had been replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. She was teaching at a community center now, playing for children who didn't care about precision or legacy, only the music. Are you ready? She asked. I've been ready for 10 years, I said. I hit enter. The screen flickered, and just like that, the Vance empire was no longer a dynasty. It was a closed chapter. We were no longer the stains on a family name, because the name itself had ceased to mean anything. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street. People were rushing to work, paying taxes, living lives that had nothing to do with charity galas or offshore accounts. For the first time, I've been ready for 10 years, I said. I hit enter. The screen flickered, and just like that, the Vance empire was no longer a dynasty. It was a closed chapter. We were no longer the stains on a family name because the name itself had ceased to mean anything. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street. People were rushing to work, paying taxes, living lives that had nothing to do with charity galas or offshore accounts. For the first time in my 26 years, I felt invisible in the best possible way. I wasn't a fence, a scrapbook daughter, or a disgrace. I was just Elena. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from the prison facility where my mother was being held. A request for a visit. I picked up the phone, the glass cool against my palm. I thought about the mahogany tables, the $2 million secret, and the cold rain of the night. It all fell apart. I thought about the woman who had called me a disgrace while she drowned in her own greed. I deleted the message. Some silences are a punishment, others are a gift. As I watched the city move below me, I realized that the best revenge wasn't the leak, the audit, or the arrest. It was the fact that I could finally breathe the air without her perfume clogging my lungs. Elena? Clara called from the kitchen. The coffee's ready. Coming, I said. I turned away from the window, leaving the ghosts of the Vance family in the sunlight. The story was over. The silence was finally mine.